First, before we start, and there's a lot to unpack, I wish to thank you on behalf of Serbian American community and Serbian Radio Chicago for being with us in Chicago a couple of weeks ago. It was a really wonderful event, and everybody really enjoyed meeting you.
Well, the honor was entirely mine, believe me.
Thank you. So let's dive in right away. There's been some renewed crisis in Kosovo, and obviously you have been a participant ever since the 1990s in the Balkan affairs and the entire destruction of Yugoslavia. You have seen it firsthand. What do you make of it? What do you make of these recent events?
Well, we have to look at what's happened recently as an extension of what's been going on for at least 2 decades at this point. We created an unsustainable status quo. When I say unsustainable, it could not be maintained without the presence of foreign military forces. And that's, of course, the last thing in the world that you want to create. You want to create some sort of solution when you intervene, as we did, with which all the parties can ultimately live. We failed to do that. We had an opportunity in 1999, in the first part of the year, January, February timeframe, at Rambouillet, to come to a solution that would have ultimately partitioned Kosovo, especially the part that is inhabited almost exclusively by Serbs up along the Serbian border, with provisions to then move additional Serbian citizens from other parts of Kosovo up there, with the cost and so forth borne by the international community. Again, the Germans in particular were quite willing to front money to pay for the movement of people around to create communities with which they could all live. This, of course, was rejected out of hand. And at the time, the argument that was made, we have to teach these Serbs that they must live in the new diverse Europe. They must learn to live, quote unquote, with diversity. So this is the early stage of diversity, equity, and stupidity that the administration has pursued now for some time. And if you look at the actors at the top of the current administration and go back to the 90s, from 1995 until 2000, you see some of the same personalities. They were more junior then and have become more senior now, but it's the same problem. So we have something that is a permanent wound that will not heal. And there's an unwillingness to accept the fact that what the Albanians want, the Muslim Albanian regime in Pristina, is to govern the whole place and impose themselves on the Serb population. Surprise, surprise, Orthodox Christian Serbs do not care to have that imposition. So until we reach some sort of accord that frankly divides this child in the fashion that I was describing, nothing is going to change. This is going to keep coming up and coming up and coming up. Adding more troops to it is not going to fix anything.
So I was going to ask, in light of the recent crisis, Stoltenberg announced that they were sending more troops, and interestingly enough, the Turkish troops were sent, and I must say I was surprised by that, especially given Erdogan's recent election. What do you think?
Well, we know that Mr. Erdogan and the Turkish state are both very, very popular in Kosovo and Bosnia, Herzegovina, and so forth. I don't think that was necessarily a Turkish initiative. Obviously, I'm no longer on the inside and can't prove that one way or the other. I can tell you that certainly 21, 22, 23 years ago, when I interacted with Turkish forces, they were extremely professional. And they behaved very, very well and did a great job for, in my judgment, NATO and the United Nations at that point. They went out of their way to cultivate good relations with the Croats and Slovenes, others who were not obviously Muslims. Now, the Turkish armed forces have changed a lot over the last 20 years. They have been through a process of Islamicization. Many, many senior officers that I knew are no longer there. There were officers that I knew quite well that ended up in jail. So I don't know how this new Turkish force will behave. Their record in the past has been professional. All we can do is hope that that will turn out to be the case this time around.
Okay. Just to go back to your comment about the initial interest in alleged diversity of the Serb population, particularly learning to live with diversity. Looking at it today, Serbia, in fact, in the entire breakup of Yugoslavia, Serbia is the most diverse country, but then you look at Croatia, you look at Kosovo, especially the areas where Albanians live, and then that portion of Bosnia, the Federation, it is completely ethnically clean. So they have cleansed everyone else, and Serbs have always lived in a very diverse, there's some 60 plus different nationalities that live today in Serbia. However, it's the Serbs that need to learn the virtues of diversity, where the rest of them have actually cleansed the Serbian population and are living in completely ethnically clean areas.
Well, you're absolutely right. And I was in the Krajina shortly after that was ethnically cleansed by the Croats. And sadly, we actually encouraged that at the time. So I think you have a two-faced operation. On the one side, the Serbs are the ones that have to be punished and learn all these hard lessons while everyone else is given a pass. I think this too goes back to Bosnia and the experience there. The senior people took an instant and permanent dislike to the Serbs. And ultimately what happens in Kosovo is another attempt to dislodge Slobodan Milosevic from power and to quote unquote punish the Serbs. There's no question about it. Now, this is stupid, self-defeating, but then the whole decision-making process was self-defeating. One of the comments that was made early on in the discussions about what should we do was to go back to the Second World War and point out that after the Second World War ended, Poland, which was extremely diverse, that had millions of white Russians or Belarusians, millions of Ukrainians, millions of Jews, as well as Poles in it, suddenly became an ethnically pure Poland, because Stalin and FDR, to a lesser extent, concluded we have to create tribal homelands or we will never have peace in Europe. So that was the logic to some extent behind how Europe was organized after the Second World War. And at the time, people said we need to do the same thing now for the Serbs and the Muslim Albanians and the rest. In other words, let's create security for each of these peoples inside borders they can live with. And over time, the borders will become less of an issue, because that's been our experience in Europe. Well, that wasn't done. That advice was not taken. And we got back to this business of we're going to drive this evil man Milosevic and these Serbs, into the corral and force them to behave the way we want them to. And then we're going to liquidate all the enemies who are responsible for all of these atrocities. Once again, atrocity being a one-way street, largely ignoring what had happened elsewhere and look almost exclusively at Serbia. Ultimately, I think the International Criminal Tribunal did a better job. They went back and started to look at all of the people that were involved in certain things. But nevertheless, at the time, it was this obsession with the Serbs. Now, we should say that there is a bright light in this otherwise dark sky. I think the American ambassador in Kosovo stepped in and said, look, this is not where we want to go. And I think the only thing we can hope for in the short run is a cooling off period, sure, where hopefully the two sides will move apart and nothing drastic will happen.
Well,
that's
and that
the
was
best we can hope for.
That was my next question, if you don't mind. You did say that the State Department, and not only the State Department, the entire Western leadership, let's say, issued stern warnings to Albin Kurti, and they essentially are laying blame on him for the recent developments. But he seems to be not hearing any of this and not heeding their call. So the question for Serbs is, well, who really is behind him? Because ultimately we know that the Albanians or even the Bosnians do not move unless they are told. So what is giving Albin Kurti this wind that he seems invincible right now?
I think this is where you have to view what's happening in Ukraine, as well as what's happening in Bosnia, as evidence for similar problems and as almost as a unified approach. The problem, I think, that occurred to the U.S. State Department and others in Europe was The last thing we need right now is a war in the Balkans between the Serbs and the Albanians, between ourselves and the Serbs, while this immense tragedy in Ukraine continues to worsen. So I think somebody stood up and said, this is a dumb idea. But remember, we right now in the United States, and I would argue that the elites, and certainly in Western Europe, are globalists as well. These are all proteges of our friend Mr. Soros in one way or another. And they, frankly, all believe in the same things. They're ideologues. They're pressing for the same kinds of things everywhere. They want to destroy Russia's borders. They want to destroy Serbia's borders. They want to flood Serbia with non-Serbs. They want to flood Russia with non-Europeans, whatever. It's the same everywhere. The problem is it hasn't worked in Ukraine. The Ukrainians are losing badly. And right now there are lots of nervous people behind the scenes that know that NATO as a military force isn't ready to do much of anything. And one of the reasons I think the Turks were asked to come in was that they're not engaged right now in any way against the Russians. As a result, they have essentially a surplus of capability. They have soldiers who are not otherwise engaged in fighting, and they have military power that they can use on behalf of NATO. That's why I think they're there. It's not because someone had some sinister idea to put Muslim Turks into Kosovo. I think it's really, look, the one people that can do this right now, who are ready and can send forces, are the Turks.